Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 35th season, I interview writers about their craft. Also, occasionally, other brands of artists. We have had on visual artists, we've had on musicians, we've had on actors. If you have an idea for a guest, writer or otherwise, who might be a good fit for the Writer's Block, watch for our address at the end of the show. I'd love to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block is a cable access product. It's a great community service that you don't get with Dish or other means of accessing the internet. So please stick with the Writer's Block, stick with cable. I'm happy to say tonight we do have a writer, Rod Kessler. He's a professor emeritus from Salem State University, and he's going to be talking about Malcolm Miller, a Salem poet that he is dedicated to perpetuating the memory of, and he's going to be talking also about his own work in a new book that just came out. Rod Kessler, welcome back.
Thank you, John.
I know you were on years ago, but it was good to see you again.
Thank you.
Who is Malcolm Miller, the poet that you are promoting and publishing and writing forwards for? Malcolm Miller, who is he?
Malcolm Miller was born in Salem in 1930 and died in 2014, so he's been dead for 10 years. When I was teaching creative writing at Salem State, I would occasionally find in my English department mailbox little self-published books of poetry. I have one here. I'll show you how small they actually were. And they were by someone named Malcolm Miller, whom I've never heard of. And inside there was always a handwritten note saying, if you like these poems, please send $5 to, and there was an address. And the address was in public housing in Salem. And I tended to just dismiss these. I didn't read them, but I thought, I'm interested in writing, and if someone is having to write to beg and make a living that way, I'm not going to stop them, so I'd always send the $5. And
so you did?
I did, and I would put these books on a shelf, and a few months later there'd be another, and a few months later there'd be another, and the $5 kept flowing for years. Well, one day, perhaps when I had more time on my hands and was in a good mood, I opened one. And to my surprise, he was an excellent poet. I should have noticed this before, but once I discovered that he was this hidden gem, I tried to reach out to him. I mean, I knew his address, and I would write to him, and I invited him to come and read to my students or talk with them in creative writing class, and he refused. I asked him if he would meet me for coffee. He refused. And he would say that he's just too old and is an anchorite, I think was the word he used.
So this is in the beginning of your career at Salem State?
No, at this point I had already been there for a long time. I mean, years had passed since he was sending me.
So he was old.
He was old, as we'll see. Well, I finally prevailed upon him through writing. He didn't have a telephone, to let me at least see if we could publish some of his poems in the college literary magazine, and he agreed to that. Now, I was the faculty advisor, but I wasn't the boss, and I had to show the students the poems, but they were very enthusiastic, and they published 10 or 11 and made him the feature poet of the issue back in 2013.
Oh, just the year before he died.
Exactly. So I got to meet him because I was carrying 10 complimentary copies to this address in public housing, and I rang the buzzer, and nobody came down for a long time, but good for me to wait. Finally, this old man opened the door, and that was Malcolm Miller, who was in his 80s, and he invited me up to his place on the second floor, but he said, you go on up there, I'll meet you, and he had to sit down on the staircase to catch his breath. He was in pretty bad shape.
What floor did he live on?
Second floor.
Second, oh.
Okay, so I got to see his Spartan existence. He was the guy who didn't have a bed, certainly didn't have a television, didn't have a telephone.
So you knew from public housing he was not rolling in money, and he needed those $5 bills.
But get this, okay, so he had one chair which he sat in, and he didn't have a dresser. I mean, his clothing were in like plastic grocery store bags that he hung on doorknobs. So he's really living as a pauper. And we talked for a while, and he took a shine to me, and God knows why, but he did. And he said, let me show you something. And he went into his kitchen, pulled up in a drawer, came out with this big fat envelope, brought it over to me. What do you think was in it? It was stuffed with $100 bills. Now, you could think, well, here's a guy who's like crazy and such a hoarder that he can't spend any money. But that wasn't really it with him. Part of it was he couldn't let the housing authority knew that he had this money because you can't, there's a certain income level. But he really believed that if you were going to be in touch with the muses, if you were going to hear like the mermaids singing, you had to live very close to the bare bones of the earth. And that's how he did.
When you mean this was stuffed with $100 bills, you mean there were $400 or $500 bills or thousands?
No. After he died, it was determined that he had over $20,000.
Just sitting in $100 bills.
Yeah. And the state reabsorbed most of it, although they did leave enough for his burying costs. But another small example, he would occasionally send me a note, could I come and help him with this or that? And one of these things was his little transistor radio had broken, and he liked to listen to opera, and he liked to listen to the Red Sox. So would I go over to the Radio Shack and get him a new radio? And I said, I'd be happy to, but why don't I give you a ride and we can do that together? So we went to the Radio Shack, and I was going to suggest to him that he buy a really substantial radio with a great speaker and all of that. He wouldn't hear of it. All he wanted was another handheld little cheap transistor, which I now have. It's in my possession. It still works. But, it gives you some sense of him. Well, let me skip ahead. Oh, go ahead.
So at that age, I know from my own experience, you want the same old to continue because it's familiar and comfortable, even though it's not as efficient as other people would like.
I'm not sure if it was that or so much his insistence on, a Spartan existence. And he had some relatives in Salem, which I didn't know at the time, but would find later. And he would basically be scornful of them because they were so bourgeois. They were lawyers and they were successful. And, he would sometimes in his earlier days pitch a tent in their backyard and, not feel too bad about showing up for dinner, but he would still, scornful of their...
Were they Millers?
No, because they had married, they were females, so they had married into other different last names. His one niece, though, who did adore him and appreciate him and has stayed in touch with the Malcolm Miller Project. She's a writer herself.
So you've been involved in this for 15 years or so?
Well, it's been 11. But let me get on with the important part of the story. So he died, and I didn't know that, but I got a call from the housing authority. Would you please come in and clear out this apartment because we have to make room for the next tenant? And I said, well, why are you calling me? Said, well, he listed you as his emergency contact. I had no idea. So I went to his apartment, which was, as I said, very shabbily furnished, but all of his manuscripts and books were there, and I collected them before they were thrown out. Now, he had given me these little books all along, but when I met him and became friendly with him, he gave me other things, including, let me show you another book of his. This was one of the first 2 books of his that was ever published. I'll pull it out here. It was published in Montreal, where he had gone to McGill.
Let me hold that up. Let me hold the cover up.
That's the book cover. But
this
the book
is the
itself, as we'll see, beautifully published, and it includes artwork. It wasn't his artwork, but you can see a lot of money went into this book.
Hold that up for a couple more minutes. I
will.
want to make sure our director, Emily Games, can get it. She's got it. Good.
So this book was published around 1970, and it sold for $30. He was appalled. He did not want to be a coffee table poet. And after this book and another one like it, he gave up on legitimate, or quote-unquote legitimate publications and stuck to these little books that we saw before.
Speaking of the little books, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for your work, can you read a couple of his poems?
Yes.
And would you read them from this book?
Right. So,
No, which is published posthumously under your guidance.
That's right. Well, it's really the second one. We did publish a book of his poems posthumously.
Right.
By,
let me hold that up.
Sure.
I'll hold this up and keep it still for a minute so that Ms. Games can
And that's
zero in.
our Grayson Press in West Hartford, Connecticut. And
and then I'll hold up the second one before you read anything.
Okay,
this
great.
This is No, and I want to mention the publisher. The publisher is Derby Wharf Light Box, and we're going to show the link to their website. This is No by Malcolm Miller, published because of the energy and insight of Rod Kessler's, and he's going to read a couple of poems of Malcolm's.
That's right.
For us.
And I should say this Derby Wharf Lightbox Press is focusing on Salem, Salem writers and Salem topics as well. So it's a small independent press and good for them. So
much as people promote and talk about Vincent Farini here in Gloucester, he is your
oh, that's right,
your adoptee.
Yeah. Anyway, so here's a couple of poems from this chapbook. The title poem is called No, and it gives you an idea of some of Malcolm Miller's whimsical qualities. I walked through a store and heard a toothbrush on the shelf saying, I wonder whose mouth I'll end up in. I rushed, terrified, into the street. There, I thought, you must face this. I returned to the store, moving along rows of painkillers. Passing a container of aspirins, I heard the aspirin saying, when I have a headache, nothing helps.
There's one request I have, is that you might read my meeting with Orson Welles.
Yes, of course, and this is a favorite of mine too. Hold on, I have that one. I printed these out in larger font. Actually, maybe I didn't. Well, I'll read it from this. Yes, it's the last poem in the book.
It's the last one.
And, for younger viewers, Orson Welles was a very famous movie producer and actor and personality in his day. My meeting with Orson Welles. Once in Rome, I was in the street when the American actor and personality Orson Welles walked by. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Orson Welles, I cried. Malcolm Miller, he said, shaking my hand. I was stunned that Orson had read my poetry books. Over drinks, he went on about some of my poems. I especially liked Wildflowers. I tried to steer talk to his movies. He pooh-poohed that at once. Movies, schmovies, he said, laughing at the mere thought. Suddenly, he was going on and on, quoting whole stanzas of my poems from memory. In truth, I began to get a little bored.
I love that. And needless to say, he was not in Rome.
I don't think he ever met Orson Welles, but he did go to Italy.
Oh, he did?
Yeah, he would save what little money he had at the time and stay at the cheapest of pensiones and drink the cheapest wine and wrote wonderful poems about it. So yeah.
Good for him. I've had a lot of cheap wine in Italy too.
Yeah.
It worked.
I should say he was very well educated. He went to St. John's Prep and then he went to McGill. So, and his writing is filled with, interesting allusions to other literature. And
so this is available from
Derby Wharf Lightbox Press.
I've got to switch now. We're going to talk about another poet with whom you are familiar, Rod Kessler. You have just come out with a book called Self-Portrait with Tree. This is Self-Portrait with Tree. Can you tell me when this came out and from where you gathered the poems that you put in this volume?
All right, so this is a good story too, I think, and one that reflects badly on me, perhaps. Or at least not, it doesn't put me on a great pedestal. I was primarily a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer, and my most recent publications over the last 10 years since my retirement have been on the op-ed page of the Salem News. But for years and years, for over 3 decades, I taught creative writing at Salem State. I taught poetry writing, and I've always loved poetry. This book has a dedication jointly to my high school English teacher, Dudley Manchester, may he rest in peace, and to the Spoken Arts Poetry Collection on vinyl in the main branch of the Hartford Public Library. Because when I was a teenager, I'd go down to the Hartford Public Library and wear those Mickey Mouse headphones and listen to recorded poetry. And anyway, so I did write poetry all through. Some of the poetry I was writing, though, was poetry designed to set models for my students. Poems that had to do with rhyming or not rhyming, or how to do it without banging the reader over the head with end rhymes and stuff. Anyway, my wife is Winter Island Press. My wife is an editor who decided to start up her own small press, and she's been publishing all kinds of interesting books. And she said to me, "Why don't we put your poetry together?" I said, "Why, nobody interested in my poetry, blah, blah." She said, No. So I went through all of my files and grabbed my poems, some of which are quite old, and we have this book. I also used to do sketches, and drawings. So some of these are all my drawings in here. Now, so I'm reading these.
On the cover is a drawing.
Yeah. I'm reading these poems that I wrote, in some cases decades and decades ago. And I said, holy smokes, that's not bad. It's actually like reading another poet, but I thought, I see the merit in this. Now, one other detail that's interesting.
Yes.
I have an unpublished novel, which I could call a failed novel, or a novel that didn't have commercial appeal. But one of the protagonists in my failed novel is a feminist poet. So I had to come up with her poetry. So it's like being a ventriloquist. I did write a handful of poems that were meant to be the poems of my fictional character. Now, I did a residency at the Vermont Studio Center and worked with a poet named Tony Hoagland, who happened to be an old grad school friend of mine. So we worked on Rain Jones's poems, and he said to me, well, you ought to try sending these out under her name. And we got one published in a feminist magazine that's women only. So it's made me
published.
Yeah, made me feel reassured. You see, there's a poem here dedicated to Rain Jones.
You said women only.
Yeah.
So
under her name.
Oh, you put it under her, your fictional character.
Yeah, so my fictional poet has published. In any case, so when you read through this collection, you'll see there are some poems that really are strongly feminist poems. I might, if I have time, read one or two. But so it's a mix match. Now, shall I read a couple?
I would love that. I would love that. By the way, I want to mention, before we go further, the publication or the press that you're talking about is Winter Island Press. And we're going to show that link so that viewers can get more information on your book and other books from Winter Island Press. And that'll be on the screen.
And, there's a bookstore in Beverly called Copper Dog, which is my primary distributor. They're carrying it. And also the Grolier Poetry Bookstore in Harvard Square has done me the honor of having a few copies on hand, too. So that's like, being in the Hall of Fame of poetry bookstores.
If you had a couple of copies, you could probably get the two downtown bookstores here in Gloucester to carry those.
Well, after I've been on writer's block, they might be interested in that.
Well,
that's good.
The
good
sales
idea.
will go through the roof after this show goes on.
That's right.
So, please read a couple of poems. I have a couple in mind.
Oh, well, what do you have in mind?
I had Eating the Dead in mind, which I liked. I love your humor and the darkness behind the humor, or I couldn't have said the darkness behind the humor, or the humor behind the darkness.
Yeah.
But I liked it. And also another poem I marked was Fission.
Okay.
but whatever you think you prefer.
Well, I'll read that poem, Eating the Dead. And, it's also, fairly old, that it talks about people in my life who have died, but they, most of them have died a long time ago. And there's been plenty more since, as the poem suggests. It's called Eating the Dead. I was slow to earn, I'll begin again. Eating the Dead. I was slow to learn the art of eating the dead. At 8, I could barely keep my Zeta Harry down. Yet by 20, I was ready for my brother, who lacked the heart to make it past 16. My high school pal Dave Edgar lost his lungs at 30 and went out as gray as the nuclear subs he serviced. Martin, my college friend, struck out at 40. The sweet Peggy, who giggled in braces in junior high, was betrayed by breasts that would never nurse a child. My mother's father, my father's mother. Now, barely a year goes by without its bloody meal. Ed Abbey wrote his final book, yet left the world unchanged. May Sarton faded off without a last goodbye. Small matter. I eat the dead every day now, my dead, and I'm getting heavy.
It's a great closure on that. I'm getting heavy.
The next poem in this book.
From the dead. I have one point I want to make about this.
Yeah.
I want to point out to our readers who may not be familiar with May Sarton. She was a very prominent poet herself, and there's a big poetry contest, which I have not won, run in her name. So thank you for that.
Well, let me talk about her for a moment, if I might.
Sure. May Sarton?
Yes. So May Sarton and I were friends, actually.
Oh, I didn't know that.
You know, I met her when I was the writer in residence at Exeter, and when she came to read there, I was asked to be her escort. And she would invite me to her place in Maine once a season. We'd go out to lunch, whatever. And we had her read at Salem State. And she was so big a name in writing in those points that we had to put the reading in the auditorium. It was the only writer ever in the Salem State Writers Series that we needed an auditorium that big for. And yet, nowadays, no one's ever heard of her. And it's a good story about how, you know, literary fame comes and goes.
Well, you see these lists of the greatest movies on the internet. Greatest movies, greatest book, greatest poets, greatest anything. And it's all people from the last 20 years.
Yeah.
It's just a pop contest.
But beware, young people. If I could read another,
please.
Since I read one, the very last poem in this book is also a poem of death. And
this is Memorial?
Memorial. And the last line of this poem is one that I think about a lot. Memorial. In dying, you've shrunk like a tire someone let the air out of. You lie in the wooden box as dry as a kitchen mat. Those fingers would snap like twigs if I dared unbend them. On this most family of Jewish moments, my stout uncle, cigar in hand, lurches at the sight of you and says, "Oh, Jesus." Your 3 daughters, decked out from Saks, don't even try to look. You ran a menswear store in Brooklyn, over the bridge. Choice, not chance, brought a man to Max's. We grandsons stand around in fine black suits. My brother's vest fits like a T. Your tailors stand proud. And I've left the silver stud from my ear on my dresser top back in Boston. I raise my camera, but the family wants the lens cap on. I could take black pictures of your death, but you've turned white on us. They screw down the lid forever on you. Can anyone sing Kaddish? God, it's moments like these that make me glad I'm immortal.
Yes, indeed. I
irony
love
there.
The family wants the lens cap on. That's very, very, very very nice. I've been working on something myself, and I want to point out in it that as people are in their 20s, and they have the great disadvantage of being immortal, destined for fame and fortune.
I could read some shorter ones too. But.
I like, as I said, the dark humor.
Yeah.
And I've got a couple other poems marked that I thought were really interesting.
Go for it.
I like Doing Without.
Oh, yes. Let me talk about that one.
Page 43.
Yep. So this was a poem, Doing Without, that I think I wrote for my writing students to make the point that you can use rhyme in subtle ways and not always put the accent on the end of the line so the rhyme's
like
bang,
a
bang,
drum
bang.
beat, yeah.
So this is a rhyme that, if you look at it closely, you see every rhyme works, but it's meant to be a little bit elusive. There's a line in French in it, which is le do de son clarinet, which is the note do of his clarinet. And I think that's the only obscurity in it. Doing Without. Last Saturday, I left a winter glove somewhere. It was lumpy, numb, made of thermoplastics, synthetic near wool, tan going gray. But it's been home for a hand 3 Januaries now. I've kept its mate. A boy in a book I had when I was 8, a French boy, lost le do de son clarinet. His do was gone. His scale began with re. Here was a puzzle. Where would you have to go to find his insubstantial do? Suppose you had to find it. Would you drum the air? I'd try it gloveless, raw-boned, fingers bare.
Very, very nice, and a good way to explain with this example how rhyme doesn't have to be a drum beat.
Yeah. I mean, towards the end, you hear the rhymes more strongly, and that's probably appropriate as your poem is ending if you're going to put that anywhere to get a sense of closure.
Well, and it reminds me of ending to a Shakespearean sonnet. Always the couplet.
Well, Shakespeare's twice the writer I am. I take that as a
You
compliment.
admit that, do you?
It's a joke. Yeah. I mean, I'm not in the ballpark, but I'll take it. What interests me about this book, of course, it has sold widely among my friendship circle and people that I knew. And people tell me which poems they like best, and it's never the same poem. So that gives me some great pleasure to think that.
Well, it's so subjective. Poetry is so subjective. It depends on the coffee level of the person who read it, and the time of day, and the mood, and a million other things. I'd like you to read quickly, because we're almost out of time, the title poem, Self-Portrait with Tree.
Very good. And that's on 36.
Oh, here, I have.
Oh, I got it. I should preface this reading by saying that this is about a real tree. If you ever get to Sunderland, Massachusetts, there's a famous tree that is even bigger than I'm implied in this.
We're almost out of time, so
Got
I've got to urge
Self-Portrait
you
with
on.
Tree. All right. The sycamore just off from the center of things in Sunderland, with its canopy broad enough to take in all of Route 47 and a swath of lawn, hedge, and sidewalk, it would take 3 of me, hand to hand, and hand to hand again, to engirdle that trunk. How I'd like that, and so would I, and so would I.
Thank you very much. That, by the way, is the title of the poem, a title of the book, and with a picture of your drawing on it with the tree. Rod Kessler, I want to thank you for being with us, sharing your research and love of Malcolm Miller, and also your own work recently published. I hope after this show goes on the air, your books sell like crazy.
Thank you very much for having me, John.
I want to thank all our audience and TV land, too, for being with us. If you've learned something about Malcolm Miller and, more importantly, Rod Kessler and his recent lively work, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next time on the Writer's Block. Good night.